Has the Quran been reliably transmitted? The answer to that question will depend on whom you ask. If you ask Christian missionaries and apologists, they'll say, no, the Quran has not been reliably transmitted. But I want to ask a different group of people, the leading Western experts on the Quran. These are not Muslims, these are professors at Western universities, and I want to get their view on this subject. And to get that answer, I'll turn to the Cambridge Companion to the Quran. This is published by Cambridge University Press. It's edited by Jane Dammen McAuliffe, herself a scholar. And this is, she has brought together an international team of scholars to talk about this subject, and others as well. They discuss the formation of the Quranic text. There's a description and analysis of the contents, transmission and dissemination, interpretations and intellectual traditions, and contemporary readings. In all, there are 14 chapters by the West's top scholars. I think they're all non-Muslim, maybe one or two judging by the names might be Muslim, but I'm not sure about that. Now, this is definitely an academic text. It's written by scholars for students of the subject, and I want to read from a chapter by a very distinguished professor of the Quran from the University of Berlin, Angelica Neuwirth. She's a name that's very well known to students of the Quran in the West, and she discusses this subject about the reliability of the text, and also she offers her comments on the traditional story that Muslims say about the origins of the Quran, about Uthman and so on. Is that something we can take seriously anymore, or do we have to jettison that traditional Muslim narrative about the reception and the origin of the Quran? Now, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from this essay of hers. Structural, Linguistic and Literary Features is the chapter. It's not very user-friendly, I'll admit that, but I'll try and make some comments, hopefully clarify what she's saying. I had to read it several times myself just to get the sense of what she's saying, but her conclusions are really important, of course, because these are experts. They're not Christian missionaries with an axe to grind to do down Muslims and do down Islam and destroy the Quran, basically, the credibility of the Quran in the eyes of people. So what do the top scholars say? On page 100, Angelica Neuwirth writes, "The presentation of Quranic developments in this chapter presupposes the reliability of the basic data of traditional accounts about the emergence of the Quran, assuming the transmitted Quranic text to be the genuine collection of the communications of the Prophet as pronounced during his activities at Mecca about 610 to 22 CE, and again at Medina until his death at 632 CE. It is true that the earlier consensus of scholarly opinion on the origins of Islam has, since the publication of John Wansborough's Quranic Studies, this is in 1977 by the way, and Patricia Crone and Michael Cook's Hagerism, also in 1997, this consensus has been shattered, she says, and that various attempts at a new reconstruction of those origins have been put forward. As a whole, however, the theories of the so-called skeptic or revisionist scholars who, arguing historically, make a radical break with the transmitted picture of Islamic origins, shifting them in both time and place from the 7th to the 8th or 9th century, and from the Arabian Peninsula to the Fertile Crescent, have by now been discarded." So just to pause there, she's saying that the radical attacks in the 1970s from people like Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, John Wansborough, which really criticised the traditional Muslim narrative of the origins of the Quran, this radical revisionist attack has basically been abandoned by scholars. It's been looked at, it's been analysed, assessed, and it's been found wanting. So it's now been discarded. These radical theories peddled by certain well-known, shall we say, missionaries like I'll mention one name, J. Smith. These have been discarded now by serious scholars. And then she says, though many of their critical observations remain challenging and still call for investigation. So they raise interesting questions, but their basic theory of rejecting the traditional account of the origins of the Quran has been discarded. In other words, they rejected it. Then she goes on. New findings of the Quranic text fragments, because, just to pause again, there have been so many earlier and earlier manuscript fragments or whole manuscripts of the Quran have been found over the recent years. We have a wealth of manuscript evidence now that goes back to within the first century of the time of the Prophet. And this makes a big difference. She says new findings of Quranic text fragments, moreover, can be adduced to affirm rather than call into question the traditional picture of the Quran as an early fixed text composed of the surahs we have. So she's saying all these manuscripts confirm the traditional account, that the Quran was fixed in the form we know it very, very early on. And we now know this because we have the evidence, we have empirical evidence, hard facts, the actual manuscripts themselves, which prove this, she says. Nor have scholars trying to deconstruct that image through linguistic arguments. So, okay, they now turn to other arguments, the radicals, using clever linguistic arguments. Nor have scholars trying to deconstruct that image through linguistic arguments succeeded in seriously discrediting the genuineness of the Quran as we now know it. So she's saying that even these attacks have failed, and the genuineness of the Quran that we now have it has been vindicated, to put it in my own words. Now, she refers to the work of Christoph Luxemburg, who views the Quran as an originally Syriac-Arabic mélange, later adapted to the rules of classical Arabic, and Gunther Lulling, who reads the Quran as a collection of hymns composed in a Christian, believe it or not, Arabic dialect, and later revised to fit the grammatical rules newly established in the 8th and 9th centuries. So these are some of the crazy ideas that have been weighed and found wanting and dismissed. Whereas Lulling's reference to the earlier hypotheses of Karl Wohlers, who had identified the original language of the Quran as broadly dialectical, points to a yet unresolved problem, Luxemburg's assumption of a Syriac-Arabic linguistic melange as the original language of the Quran lacks a methodologically sound basis. This is a scholarly way of saying it's crap. I mean, it just has no basis. There's no evidence for it. It's just hypothesis and speculation. She continues to conclude, the alternative visions about the genesis of the Quran presented by Wansborough, Crook and Lulling and Luxemburg are not only mutually exclusive, in other words, they all contradict each other, but rely on textual observations that are too selective to be compatible with a comprehensive Quranic textual evidence that can be drawn only from a systematically microstructural reading. So just to put that into in simpler English, she's saying that the alternative is the revisionist scholars about the origins of the Quran, from Wandsworth, Crone, Crook, Lulling, Luxemburg. Not only do they contradict each other, so they can't all be true, any one of them in theory could be true, but they rely on textual observations that are too selective. In other words, they don't use a comprehensive, wide basis of evidence. They are very selective and they pick on little things and make big theories. They're not looking at a comprehensive, as she says, Quranic textual evidence. They're not looking at all the evidence. So that's the passage there I just read in pretty dense academic language. But the conclusion I draw on this top expert who's not a Muslim at the University of Berlin, expert on the Quran, is that the traditional Muslim story of the genesis of the Quran, in other words, it was given to Muhammad during his own lifetime, codified into one single text, if you like, just after by Uthman, we all know the story. This has not been successfully challenged by radical and skeptical scholars. These radical skeptical scholars are now pretty much not accepted as having anything valid to say any longer. Their theories are discarded, although some of the questions, she says, that they raise are still of interest. So there is that. But the traditional, but she herself says, the beginning of this passage I read, that she she assumes the genuineness of the Quranic text that we have today being the same text that goes back to Muhammad. So that's her working hypothesis. It's not been successfully challenged by radical skeptic scholars. So there we have it. We have two very different views. We have the views of Christian missionaries who say we don't have a reliable text, and we have the views of the experts, the scholars, the people who are professors in this subject, who say the opposite. So I think I just find that very, very interesting. This book is worth getting, actually. Against a scholarly text, it's a very advanced text, but it provides you with some real information about actual scholarly research, rather than perhaps the propaganda that you'll come across from Christian websites and missionaries. Until next time.